Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. And we've got a real treat for you today, listeners. I say that a lot, but it's always true. The hearts of these people are great. So welcome to the show, Maya Fleischmann.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me.
So last time Maya and I spoke, she came up with a fantastic phrase that really hit me between the eyes. The glorification of trauma. And that's where we're going to be. That's going to be our kicking off point for the conversation today. But before that, just if you could give the listeners a little bit of background, Maya, that would be great.
Okay. I was born in Hong Kong in the late 1960s. It was a colonial colony back then. And I was removed from my Chinese family at about the age of 2 or 3 and privately adopted by a Russian Jewish couple who were expats living in Hong Kong. And I was raised in a Western environment in Hong Kong. And so I went to a British school. I slowly just let go of my Chinese. And so I grew up not really fitting in the Western world or in the Chinese world. And so I had a lot of confusion, frustration, anger growing up, and I never really tied it in completely to being adopted because it wasn't spoken about much. And so it's taken me decades of just slowly uncovering these emotions I have and trying to figure out what they were from. And even up to just a few years ago, realizing just how deep the pain can go, but also how empowered I was by my experience.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that pain, it hurts, right?
Yeah.
It really hurts. Yeah. So, and I was late 60s as well, and that there's an awful lot of people on the show around that age. They're either a couple of years younger than me, a couple of years older than me. We have a preponderance, I think is the word, for people around the area. So this glorification, can you express, can you share a little bit of background? What do you mean by the glorification of trauma?
Okay, so the context for how that phrase just came up when we were talking is that we were talking about the negative bias in media and on some social platforms, and how it can sometimes focus and glorify the debilitating effects of trauma on our lives. And I think this perspective can actually hinder our ability to understand and live with our trauma, our pain. And I think it can also prevent us from finding a potentially empowering way to harness the experiences and just sort of use the knowledge to move us forward in life rather than hold us back further.
So it sounds to me the decades that you've talked about, and some this is kind of seems like a really hard won perspective shift for you. Like something was there an aha moment about that, or was it a series? How did that kind of insight come to you, right?
You mean, how did I come to terms with the adoption, or sort of harness the trauma to work for me?
Yeah, I was perhaps a little bit before that in terms of you've noticed something. You've noticed that there's a negativity bias towards this debilitating side of trauma. And I'm just wondering how do you remember when you saw that?
I think it was a slow awareness that my inability to harness or accept the past was really affecting my health. And I didn't like how I was feeling. And I realized little by little that I had to sort of find a way to accept my past, accept or compartmentalize my experiences, find some way to live with my trauma. And like I said, it took me a long time to realize that being adopted was a trauma, because growing up, everything was quote unquote normal. And any issues I was having was because I was a naughty child. And so, I just really grew up with all these emotions ingrained in me as part of my personality. And little by little, I realized that it wasn't necessarily me, that there was something in my past that was influencing me. And as I came to understand that my emotions were being affected by even by an experience that I hadn't even consciously linked to my emotions, I set about to find ways to, and I hesitate to say embrace the trauma, but find a way to live with it and to tolerate it, to have some sort of understanding with my past, so that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't insecure anymore. I could find a way to look at any positives that were coming from this. And for me, that was understanding that, as a child, I must have been a pretty tough cookie because I went through a lot, and starting to embrace the positive aspects that I had come away with. And but it's a slow process. Like I said, once I started realizing that a lot of my negative attitude was related to something that I had no control over anymore, I just had to shift my perspective and compartmentalize that and move forward with what I could do about it, in terms of writing my book, in terms of speaking to other people who are adopted and helping one another through experiences. So yeah, it maybe sounds simple, but it's such a complex process, and it varies because all our personalities are different, our experiences are different. So I don't want to sound like I'm oversimplifying it.
No. I mean, just going back a bit. I was chatting to another fellow adoptee who's been on the show before, and he's also a therapist. Just before we spoke, called Elliot Driscoll, and he said we can't be objective about our own experience, right? Mm-hmm. So we are living in our normality. We're everything seems kind of normal to us. We're just we don't have as kids, and until we speak to others, we don't have any comparison. Life is the way that life is, and until we see something differently. So you've used the word realize twice, 3 times, 4 times, and you've also used the word perspective, right? So that's what it seems to me. It's when we realize something, right? When we see the world with realize, as they say, and so we can't see it until we see it, and then when we see it, we can't unsee it. You talked a lot last time about anger. You've mentioned it again here, and I've definitely felt that too. It's quite a common thing of those experience. Were there any do any landmarks come to mind, or key moments, key moments when you saw something differently? Does anything?
Well, I was really under the impression that I had come to terms with my adoption and my emotions. And it was just a few years ago that I listened to filmmaker Glenn Morey's audiobook called Side by Side. It's a documentary about adult Korean adoptees telling their stories. I was in my early 50s, and I was thoroughly surprised at how emotionally wrecked I was just minutes into the book. And I think part of this was, you talk about perspective and that we can't be objective, but also it was this validation and this sense that I was normal, that all these experiences that I've had were normal for people who have gone through similar trauma of being adopted. And I mean, of course, not everybody has the same experiences. I have to caveat that. But generally, a lot of the emotions I went through, a lot of the symptoms of being adopted, especially inter-country adoptees, were very similar. And that validation, that normalization also was very freeing. And I was very surprised that, 5 decades later, I was still experiencing release of this pain of a trauma that happened decades ago. And so I think the trauma, it's like living with a scar that's on your face, and because you see it all the time, sometimes you don't see it, and you just live your life, and then every once in a while you notice it. And so for me, I think that's what adoption is. Being adopted it's just one of those experiences that you can live with, and every once in a while something may trigger a painful memory or a painful emotion, but like everything else in life, you in order to live your best life, you have to just sort of find a way to move through it, live with it, accept it, and not let it take away any more of your life.
Yeah. A couple of different things that you're saying are ringing a chord with something that I came up with the other day, actually. So there's this validation thing, right? So validation frees us. It freed you. You could see that. I think, I don't know who it was, another adoptee that said this, that what we see our own normal response to an abnormal situation, right? It's abnormal for a baby to be taken away from the mother. So it's a normal response to an abnormal situation, and that's the freeing effect. That it's a different way to express what you mentioned. It's a freeing effect from that validation. So there's a release, right? There's a release. We don't think, I'm not going nuts. I'm not an inherently bad person. Whatever, we all have different ways of saying that. There's a validation there. And yet, you talk about you mentioned the word debilitating earlier on, and I think that what we see on social media is you're spot on. It is debilitating. So validation, on one hand, it can kind of free us, and on the other hand, it can also reinforce it. It can reinforce the negative thing. So it struck me that validation is like a double-edged sword.
Right. Well, it depends what the validation is for. And if it's for something that helps you grow, then that's great. But if the validation keeps you mired in your baggage, then no matter what it is, it's not a positive thing.
Yeah.
And also I think part of the freeing effect for me of hearing other adoptees' stories was that it contradicted a lot of the myths that I had grown up with, which were, just everything's fine, everything's normal, and you're a lucky little girl, all the usual myths that go around adoption. And so to hear that other people also had a conflict emotionally with these myths was very liberating for me.
Yeah. Was there any anger around that for you?
Anger around what?
Around the fact that that you hadn't been told this earlier, almost, that the myth.
Yeah, the irony is that my parents never spoke to me about my adoption, but because they're Caucasian and I am Asian, it was very clear I was adopted. And so I remember as a child thinking it was very strange that my parents never spoke to me about being adopted, because I clearly was not their child. But because nobody spoke about adoption, it was almost like a really taboo word. I just grew up thinking it was something to be very ashamed of, and or that it was normal. It was a normal occurrence and there was nothing to talk about, or I shouldn't be talking about it. Either way, it had a very negative effect on my self-esteem.
Yeah. And it's got to be pretty confusing, that as well, right?
Yeah, it's confusing, and it was very difficult when people would say, you don't look like them. And, people always trying to figure out where I was from, if I was the maid's child or if they were my grandparents, because they were in their 50s when they adopted me. And just growing up dreading questions about my past, it was also very, it created a lot of insecurity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and
it's
something, and it's something, that insecurity sort of went away as I became older, sort of became comfortable within my own skin. But there are always comments and people challenging the experience of adoption, or telling me you're not really Jewish because you're Chinese, they're not your real parents. And besides being a very insensitive thing to say to somebody, it doesn't really understand the premise of adoption, that if somebody has adopted you, they're giving you're part of the family now, and that becomes at least partially your story, if that's what you want to adopt. So I think the myths with adoption are prevalent, and I don't know if that will ever change, but I think it is because nowadays people actually talk about adoption.
Yeah. It's, to me, it swung perhaps the other way. We've gone from rainbows and unicorns to this trauma obsession. And something I came up a while ago is we should be trauma informed, but hope obsessed, or trauma informed and healing obsessed. That's because I see so much of that negativity, and have felt that myself. Right, you know, it's a dark. The trauma just gets darker the further you go down the trauma tunnel. It just gets darker, and so luckily I had some people that pointed me to the light that was still there at the end of the tunnel. So you're talking about this this validation. So validation to help you grow, or validation that keeps keeps you mired. So how do you distinguish between those two? What's happened? What have your learnings been around that topic?
Well, I find that when people are what you call trauma obsessed, if it's not helping you move forward, if it's not uplifting, if it's just rehashing of the past, and it's not making you feel good, then like any discussion, then maybe it's not helpful. And also sometimes I think just talk and about negative things, for me that's just like bombarding myself with watching the news. It doesn't help. Maybe go volunteer, maybe go do something, talk to people that can help you move beyond that. For me, I know I joined a couple of adoptee social groups, and I found that some of them were very I don't know what the word was, beyond negative. I think they were too angry for me, and so I had to leave. And sometimes, you know, it depends on what stage you are of grieving, what stage you are of moving on. That anger is one of the stages, I imagine, that you have to go through. But I feel like sometimes people don't want to let go of the anger. And I know from personal experience, from having anger, that I wasn't really sure what it was from, but whatever it was from, holding on to it really was not good for my health. And it wasn't good for my mental clarity. And also I didn't like who I was. And so I made a conscious effort to let go of that. And so I think being around people who want to work through their trauma, who want to work through their pain, who want to do something with the knowledge that they've gained as adoptees, you know, and it doesn't have to be knowledge about adoption necessarily, but about the pain, the empathy, that is something that's creative and uplifting. And I think that's something positive for the adoptee and other people around them.
Yeah. Was there a moment when you talked about letting go of the anger? Was there an instance that happened? Was there a key point where some epiphany or a shift or a realization happened?
You know, there have been so many, and like I said, it's been this gradual process over decades, because I wasn't really sure what it was tied to. And so it's not as though I realized, oh, I was adopted, this is where all the pain's coming from. It was just this realization that this negative emotion isn't helping me, this negative emotion isn't helping me. But one of the things I do remember was when I was a teenager and I was considering looking for my birth mother. And even as an adult, when I was looking for my birth mother, it it became more just curiosity. I realized there was no point in having this desperation, because the past was the past, and maybe it would answer a question, but it was this little realization that I had to be comfortable in my own skin, and knowing her, meeting her could be a wonderful thing, or it could be a disastrous thing. And so if I was going to look for her and meet her, it it would have to come from a place of curiosity, not need.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, you call that a little realization. That's huge. That's really
Oh,
huge. Yeah, curiosity is. I can't think of a better word for it. And that's what it's about. It's kind of I guess it's the icing on the cake, is it? Like the cake is your own. The cake is your own comfortable. Your comfort in your own skin. Your sense of yourself is the cake, and then the connection with meeting the birth mother is it's just the icing on the cake. I think that those expectations can really
they can do you in.
they can do us in, especially if people have had it's like if the questions have been there all the time, all their life, decades of questions, and you're thinking, right, and everything's riding on this one thing, and then when it happens, we don't know which you were. You had sufficient perspective to see that it could go either way, and being okay with whatever the outcome is. Did you reunite, or?
I never met my mother, but I did the DNA test through 23andMe, and I found a cousin, and through her, I found her family, and her father is my uncle, and he was actually living in the house and raised me for the time that I was living in the house. So that was really interesting, and it was really fascinating to see these baby pictures of me, where all the photos I had seen, I was about 3 years old, and my first photos in my new family. So it was, and that in itself was an experience, because I always had said I was born at the age of 3, because that's the only photo I had of myself. And suddenly to realize that I had this whole other life before I had started this new life as an adoptee.
Yeah. And how did that impact you?
It was very, very interesting, because my personality really resonated with my uncles and my cousins. And when I went to meet them, it was as though we had been together all this time. And it made me really believe in epigenetics, and the fact that DNA hugely impacts our behavior and carries through from generations, because there were so many similarities between my uncle and myself in behavior. So
Yeah. The chap that I mentioned earlier on, the adoptee, who was also a therapist, Elliot, he the topic that he came up for his interview for the podcast was genetic validation, and it goes to that. So I'll put a link in the show notes, everybody, in case you want to check out a bit more detail on what DNA genetic validation is all about. So did this, how did this impact your kind of sense of self? Because presumably it's filling in some gaps.
It filled in a lot of gaps in terms of knowing what had happened to me. And I guess my mother had a falling out with my father, and had one day my uncle and father came home and I was gone. My mother was gone. And just from the photos my uncle had and the first photos of me in my new house, my mother, who was a single mother at that point in early 1970s Hong Kong, probably was having a very difficult time about it, and so had to give me up for adoption. And so, understanding all that, it helped satiate my curiosity, because at this point it was curiosity, because I really had come to terms, or to some sort of understanding, that my mother had given me up for the best reasons. And perhaps it was a story I had told myself, but either way, it made me feel better, and it helped me get through many years. And so I saw no harm in that.
Yeah.
And so it helped in that way. But like I said, it was more a curiosity, at that late stage in my life. It has been a really long journey to realize that I didn't need external validation. Being adopted or not, as a human being, I didn't need external validation that I had to be a whole person and self-confident based on my own belief in myself, in my own self-worth. And it helps when you get validated, but I couldn't depend on that. And I think that was a huge step towards me starting to feel whole.
So you were able to look inwards rather than outwards.
Right.
Yeah.
And just be happy within myself.
Yeah. And how's this manifested in other parts of your life with the
I've had a lot more calm in my life, as I realize that I am in charge of my bliss to a huge extent. I mean, we can't control, external factors. People still piss us off, life is stressful, but we can, to some degree, manage how we respond to life around us. And it's a constant choice for me to say, okay, look, I don't want to go down the path of being sick and stressed out. And I choose to find a way that will keep me healthy, find a way to manage my stress, find a way to deal with this situation the best I can. And to some degree, at some point with a lot of situations, we have to just do what we can and then just let it be, because we can't control life.
Yeah. So some people talk about the gap. So something happens, right? And then there's a gap between us either responding or reacting. So the response bit is the sounds like that's what's happened. There's been a shift from reacting, and you talked about anger and
right. So learning not to be triggered and learning to respond from a place that has more perspective and being grounded versus just being triggered by everything. And I think a lot of that comes with age, but I think a lot of it is a conscious choice And of course, we're all human, and we can't always have that patience. I mean, we have it's work, but
Yeah,
life is worth it to try and enjoy your life, not to stress out, to basically live your best life.
yeah. And so it's like it's a percentage game.
Mm-hmm.
It's a percentage game, but versus it's not an all or nothing. It's not a zero sum game. Like, I mean, we're not always responding. We've not
Right.
shifted from reacting 100% of the time to responding 100% of the time. It's a numbers game, but the trend
Right.
is in a positive direction. Yes, as we get more and more perspective.
Right. Perspective. That's the key word there.
Yeah. What does perspective mean to you?
Perspective means to me being able to see where I am in the big picture. And I think one of the reasons I really enjoy traveling to new places or to countries where I may or may not speak the language is that it helps me get perspective on life. It helps me remember that there's this huge world out there, and I'm just a tiny portion of it, that there are many, many different kinds of people, and there are a lot of people who have stereotypes, and they aren't often true. And traveling is one of the ways I feel I get perspective. I'm grounded in the knowledge that there's this huge world out there, and life is like that. It's big, and we can just do the best we can.
Yeah. Do you have a metaphor that comes to mind for perspective?
For
I've got a couple up
perspective.
my sleeves. I've got a couple of my sleeves if you're struggling, but I'd rather use yours. You
No,
talk
I
big picture. Talk about
uh
big picture.
no, yeah, just I can't think of one offhand.
People talk about seeing the wood for the trees.
Right.
Yeah, looking down from the big picture. And that's the one I've used for a while. But I heard a better one a couple of weeks ago, which was as we climb up the side of a valley, we see the same valley differently as we go
Right.
up the valley sides, and we see it more clearly. And that's what I think perspective is about.
Right.
We're seeing things more clearly. We're seeing closer to the truth.
And perspective changes. And I think that the other thing that helps someone be resilient is to be flexible in your perspective, and also to be flexible and to changing ideas and growth, and yeah, so I think the closest metaphor I would have it is very similar, is like walking somewhere and you aren't sure where the trail is going. Sometimes it may change, and you have a general idea of where you want to go, but you don't necessarily know what the terrain's going to be, what you're going to see, and that's life's journey,
Yeah.
and you just have to have the flexibility.
Sorry.
You just have to have that flexibility
Flexibility. Yeah.
and that wide-eyed curiosity to just be able to enjoy the trek.
Yeah. I heard something on this a couple of weeks ago that I loved, which is it kind of sums up what you're saying. I think it was about we're obsessed with where we're going,
Right.
and it was somebody who was saying, I'm not so bothered about where I'm going, it's where I'm coming from that's really important. So it's almost like like the foundations, like the foundations of a building. or you understanding your early life, those first 3 years, because you didn't have any pictures of you below 3, and understanding all the reasons for the adoption is kind of where you're coming from. So once we're stronger in our footings, then I guess to carry on the metaphor, once the footings are stronger, the tower that grows out of that is going to be more stable.
Right, but I think what's important too is sometimes you don't know what that you never do get that information that you want for the foundation, but do you have the strength and do you have the ability to create your own foundation? And I think that's the key, that before I found out about my past, I had already figured out how to create a foundation. And maybe that was telling myself stories, and um and and maybe it was just accepting certain things just blindly, but it worked for me, and it gave me the foundation I needed to move forward in life. And I think that was good. And I'm reminded of a line in the movie Karina, and it's Ray Liotta, Whoopi Goldberg, and a young actress. And the girl's mother has died, and Whoopi Goldberg is the nanny that's taking care of her. And she tells the little girl, "Oh, your mother's in heaven." And so the little girl's elated, and the father says to the girl something about, "Well, why would she say that your mother goes to heaven?" And the little girl says, "Well, what's wrong with that?" And he says, "Well, it makes you just believe this story that might not be true." And the girl says, "What's wrong with that?" And for me, that's really, I needed to have some sort of framework established for me to move forward. And so I came to the understanding that my mother left me because she loved me, and it was necessary. And whether or not it was, it doesn't really matter, because it's in the past. I can't change it anyway. But that framework made me feel good enough to say, you know what, that's life, and I choose to believe this. And if I find out otherwise, then I'll deal with it then.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of that thing. If you're going to talk to yourself, you might as well say something nice.
Right, exactly. So yeah.
I've got some work to do on that. Yeah. I love that. Yeah, I love the way that you took my metaphor and made it far more concrete and empowered with your own self. That was great. I was doing you a disservice with that. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, Maya? I'm conscious of time. Is there something that I've not asked you about that you'd like to talk about?
No, I think we've covered it. I think for me, the biggest thing I did for myself was to change my perspective and just realize that miring myself in negativity, holding myself back in the past, whether it's the adoption, whether it's anything, just wasn't serving me. And I wanted to move forward. I wanted to make the best of whatever life I have left. And I just realized it was just kind of, I was just kind of a drag on myself, having a negative attitude, and I just wanted to be happy. And maybe that sounds Pollyannish, but I don't know if there's anything wrong with trying to be happy and just being fulfilled and doing what I felt helped me feel creative and inspired. And I think everyone, as I said, has their own timeline to do that. But I think people have the power and the resilience to move beyond their pain. And sometimes it takes more work than other times, but it's definitely something that a path that should be started, and embarked on.
Yeah. I think you've just got the title for the podcast then.
What?
Beyond the Pain.
Oh, okay. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah. Do you like that? Do you think that would be a good title?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was also, something else was going through my mind about the disglorification of trauma, something like that. But beyond the pain is sounds far more succinct and
Yeah.
on point with what you've talked about, I think.
Or, yeah, deglorifying trauma, as you said. That's a mouthful.
It is.
So, but yeah, so I think we've covered everything. It's complex, but interesting, very interesting, introspective work.
Yeah, got to do the work. So, as
Yes.
always, listeners, I urge you to check out the show notes for links to Maya's book and some of the social channels and stuff like that. And we will speak to you again very soon. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, listeners. All the best.
Thanks, Simon.